Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. In this episode, we turn our focus to the United States, where President Donald Trump has ignited a wave of executive orders targeting gender rights. From policies cloaked in the language of protecting women, to legislation that could restrict voter access for trans and gender diverse individuals, these developments raise urgent questions about democracy, identity, and power. To help us unpack the historical roots and global implications of these policies, I'm joined by Claire Somerville, Executive Director of the Gender Center here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Together, we'll explore how gender is being politicized, what's at stake for marginalized communities, and how similar debates are unfolding beyond U.S. borders. So Claire, thank you very much for joining us on this episode of What Matters Today. My first question for you is, upon taking office for the second time in January, Trump signed multiple executive orders attacking gender. Can you comment on the historical context of this hostility towards gender and women?
Sure, thank you for inviting me. You're right in noting that women and gender, more broadly actually, have featured pretty heavily in this era of executive order-based policy making in terms of gender, right. I think, that's coming out of the United States. And it even featured in Trump's inauguration speech, which I think is in itself significant. And it's actually worth quoting what he said. His line was, "As of today, it will be henceforth the official policy of the United States governments that there are only two genders, male and female." These are substantive political claims that place the material body within a direct control of the state in ways that do not necessarily reflect the lived realities. And in some contexts, they even erase the existence of some categories of personhood, and at the very least present a real threat to any nuanced or complex understanding of biology or the human condition. What is interesting is that same day in the afternoon, Trump goes a step further in his executive orders, and he has two that day that he signs that are directly related to gender and women's rights. But they're with a veiled threat. In a sense, he says, and I quote again, "All federal employees shall use the term sex and not gender in all federal policies and documents." So this is almost as an Orwellian newspeak if you think of the novel 1984, because what you're doing is controlling realities through language. These are speech acts and executive orders that really silence groups and attempt to eliminate groups through a language, and therefore very serious, and we should be concerned. So by dissolving a category and eliminating words from the government vocabulary, you begin to chip away at groups who live different realities. And of course, he signs nearly 150 or perhaps even more than 150 executive orders since then. Many of them reiterate these same messages, and they particularly address transgender in the military, transgender affirming care. So I think what this does is it really raises concerns about what the Trump administration and others since in other places have regarded as a biological truth, which is highly restrictive. So is this new, you ask? What's the historical context? The historical context of redefining and exploring biological sex has a long history. It has a history even in elite sports and the governing bodies of sport, and is under constant revision and scientific exploration as well. When we think about chromosomes and hormones, they were only discovered in the 1950s and subject to scientific intervention in the body to be visible. But of course, throughout history, beyond that biology history and scientific history, there have been efforts to control particularly women's bodies, their clothing, their social and political roles in society. And these are often under the theological and political guise of moral and social order. Or sometimes, like now, they're in efforts to restore a previous imaginary time. We think of this sort of "Make America Great Again." It is harking back to a time of imaginary Historically, we've had, in, say, 17th, 18th century, when there are times of great transformation in societies and industrialization, we get a pushback on women's rights to claim political autonomy, to claim bodily autonomy. And of course, the same has been said is the case, in fact, for all gender minorities. And if we think it's not until 1990 that the WHO declassified homosexuality as a mental disorder. So that's pretty late. So we have a mix of histories from the sciences and from our social political history that suggest there are pushbacks. Of course, the one in most recent years that is really coming through now is the one that started in the late 1990s. And it came from the Vatican initially, which was opposed to terms like gender and sexual rights, and really wanted to propose an agenda of the natural family. And this framing has really since migrated into global politics and has been picked up particularly by authoritarian leaders. And I think this in itself is interesting because often the redefining the definition of the body, the human body, is connected to the body politic and statehood and borders and boundaries. And we see all these colliding in the current mix of global geopolitics around states and conflict. So in that sense, it's not surprising that the body and the control of it comes back under state control in these types of executive orders. Historically, we know that to be the case, but I think there's something particular about the case at the moment. And that we can describe as something which is transnational in its nature. It's not just about Trump. It is about other leaders in the world across the globe from different spectrums also engaging in this sort of control of the body, bodily autonomy, focused mainly upon women and gender minorities, but actually it affects everybody and it leads to increased surveillance on all bodies, however they are presented. But this, of course, always goes back to the boundaries of a state and the nation state trying to assert itself in opposition to conflict. And this particular one brings up interesting geopolitical alliances that tend to act in synchrony, bridging faith groups, which in itself is interesting. Political enemies are aligned on this, different financial streams that crisscross the globe. And they tend to reproduce and mimic the processes of the UN system, which is also, ironically, their target. Often these kinds of ideas are used to chip away at multilateralism, which we know is under a considerable threat at the moment, and it's fragile. One thing I think is different from previous is it's notable even in the voting patterns at the UN, in the Human Rights Council, at the World Health Assembly, where we see a sort of geopolitical paradox and unlikely alliances between different authoritarian regimes, religious conservatism, right-wing think tanks, which are united by a particularly shared agenda on this. Russia, for example, has positioned itself as a global defender of traditional values, using LGBTIQ plus rhetoric to consolidate some of its soft power in voting patterns within the UN system. Other blocs and states have done similar things. So we see geopolitical alliances among states that are not necessarily aligned in other areas. And we also see a particular rise of civil society counter to what has been the last 10 years, the sort of general thinking around civil society as a shrinking space. In this area of anti-rights and anti-gender, we see a huge emboldening of their work, a huge financial streams going into their work, and they have the ear of many member states. So on the one hand, you ask, is it historical? Is there a context for this? Yes, absolutely. But I think there is something quite unique about what's happening here because gender is a soft entry point to destabilizing and making more fragile some of the multilateral relations that are being currently attacked.
And ironically, while Trump has been undermining the rights of women in his policies, the language used in his executive orders, such as, and I quote, defending women from gender ideology extremism, end quote, pretends to be protecting women. How does Trump's use of, quote, protecting women language mask a patriarchal agenda, and why is that dangerous?
Absolutely. This kind of language is really textbook examples of patriarchal protectionism. And the idea that women must be shielded rather than empowered.
Because he would use that in the campaign as well.
Exactly.
He's protecting women. Right?
Exactly. And I think this also comes, of course, from, I mentioned civil society there, but the Heritage Foundation and its Project 2025, which, of course, put the protection of women as one of its core pillars. Given what we also know from what I've just explained about the executive order and redefinitions of what is womanhood, according to the Trump administration, that also refers to a particular type of women when they're talking about protecting. It's not all women in all their diversities. They really have developed this notion, which again came from the Vatican in the late 1990s, of a gender ideology. That is a sort of extremist, they describe, ideology that women are at risk of. We have to be protected from this. So he really then positions himself as a defender of women, whilst in reality he's enacting, or they are enacting, policies that really roll back on reproductive rights, they weaken workplace protections, and they silence gender diverse voices. So it's very much a sort of rhetorical sleight of hand. And I think this fixation with the bounder body, that is immutable, it cannot be changed. So that men, I think in their words, they just say, can't become women, and gender identity is not sex. So the logic here is about they have control over defining what is womanhood, what can be construed, constructed and constituted as womanhood in law. And they use this logic, they're defending women against attack, and they're defending their dignity and their safety. One has to ask then, what is unsafe about this? What safety are they protecting? Gender-based violence would be something that is a concern of women, and something that whilst not wanting to extend this protectionist thing, it should be a matter of concern, and inequalities related with that, inequalities of power. What is interesting and curious about this is, again, I think there's something Orwellian about it, to come back to that idea of doublethink in Orwell. That's been the idea that you can hold two contradictory beliefs at once. War is peace, for example. But here, in the case of women, it's control is protection. So by controlling women and controlling their bodies, it's possible to believe you're at once protecting them at the same time. So in a sense, it's a very strategic repackaging that Trump has used, and a campaign of rhetoric to protect women and protect them from this, as I said, gender extremism. But what they actually do, of course, is reassert that patriarchal control over who counts and what rights and what bodies count in society. So it's really the same playbook that's been used historically. Again, it was used in eras of moral purity, campaigns for the family values during the Cold War, accusations of witchcraft going back to the 16th, 17th century, where women are cast as vulnerable, in need of protection, as opposed to being political agents. So I think ultimately there are two dangers with this. The dangers are twofold. There are many dangers, but twofold, in the sense that it really legitimizes surveillance of bodies, all bodies, but particularly gender non-conforming bodies. It divides, it has the potential, and it's used strategically to divide feminists by weaponizing womanhood itself and defining it through this tight binary or particular binary biology. I think this is also the case that the danger lies in how effective this framing is. It co-opts a lot of feminist language like safety and dignity, the things that feminists really care about in gender-based violence, and somewhat redirects it towards exclusion and control. So rather than addressing the violence or economic inequalities, it targets these dangers, this sort of enemy within, as it were, this extremism, this gender ideology that somehow crept into our society and lays the blame and defaults us to think about that rather than the fundamental structural inequalities in society. And it also promotes this sort of biologically essentialist view that ultimately disempowers women in all of their diversities.
Do Trump's gender policies amount to an attack on trans, intersex, and non-binary people beyond just women?
Absolutely. In fact, they are, I think, more often more directly targeted even at
Right.
trans, intersex and non-binary people, particularly in some of the executive orders related to the military and access to care. They are certainly targeting this group. Again, it's sort of this reassertion of state control over the body, who can be citizens in a sense. And of course, this even speaks to the SAFE Act in terms of voting, whereby your exercise of the vote will require a identity document that aligns with your sex identity. And any name changes or gender identity changes may disallow you from the capacity to vote. You'll be disenfranchised by this. So again, what it is, it's about those borders again and about citizenship. Who can be a citizen of this country or any country? And the state is going to control that and control the knowledge and authority that defines those particular bodies.
And my final question, while Trump's administration has led a wave of anti-gender policies in the US, similar trends are emerging globally. You even mentioned that. In the UK, the Supreme Court recently ruled that the legal definition of a woman is based on biological sex under the Equalities Act. Gender-critical feminists have hailed this as a victory, while others warn of its impact on trans, intersex, and non-binary people. What does this ruling signal about the broader gender debate in the UK, and what are its implications?
I think this really points to this transnational anti-gender, anti-rights phenomena that we're witnessing at the moment. This particular case is about a point in law from 2010 with the Equalities Act, where there is no definition of what is a woman. And this was the question that came up in this particular court case. Like the Trump administration, the default here has been to say biological. This is quite problematic from a social science and I think even by a biological biologist's perspective, a scientific perspective, because as I said, what counts as biology is contested and it is evolving and changing over time. So this particular Supreme Court ruling really tries to perhaps anachronistically go back to 2010 and try to define what they said women were then. And of course, in the 15 years that have since passed, our thinking and our understanding of this has totally transformed. Mm-hmm. And we can see that with, as I said, the rulings in elite sports and so forth, and our ability to measure hormones differently and to calibrate them to mean different things. So it's an unfortunate retrospective on definitions, trying to hark back to a time, again, a sort of reimagining of what was thought of as women in 2010, without the preceding time that we have seen many differences. And I think it's highly problematic because, again, it doesn't actually ask the question, what is the biological? And I think that is now the question that will return to the courts, is what do you mean by biological? Yeah. And that's the subject of decades of research in the social sciences to try to pin down what that is meant by that in the medical sciences. But by anchoring this sort of legal definition to biological sex, the court aligns itself with a broader conservative and gender-critical movement that certainly is deemed to be rolling back on gains that have been made on the trans and queer rights. So this very narrow legal recognitions really fuels a divisive debate that puts all women, I think, and pits cisgender women against trans rights. And it's a false binary, and it's very problematic and very heated dispute in the UK. But I think beyond that legal case, it's not just a legal matter in the sense it's very symbolic as well. Right. It sends a message that gender diversity is legally suspect or politically expendable. I've written before about the ways in which gender has become part of negotiation, tradecraft within the United Nations, that it's something that can be exchanged and transacted in different negotiations. And again, I think we see a replication of this happening in the UK Supreme Court ruling. And again, just like with the Trump administration's concern for this, it will lead to greater surveillance and greater state control, but greater surveillance over everybody's body, particularly those that present in non-stereotypical ways as male or female, and can lead to, I think, even potential increases in gender-based violence as a result, a direct result of that increase in surveillance. So I think what we're witnessing is as part of a sort of a global realignment where gender becomes something of a proxy battlefield for far deeper cultural and political anxieties that include anxieties about national borders, about the family, about the role of the state, and about the conflicts, actually, that we're presently in. I don't think we can entirely separate what's happening and these concerns with what's happening in the various conflicts at this moment in time in the world. They are part and parcel of the same ideologies that fuel the expansionist agendas. And of course, the role of the reproductive mother, the reproductive woman, is very important to statecraft. It's always been through that nationalisms have been built. So hence, it is not surprising that control over what constitutes that woman, that particular type of reproducing woman, and what constitutes an erasure, I believe the attempt at erasure of gender as a concept becomes vitally important for these expansionist geopolitical contexts at the moment, and will very likely breed greater conflict. And I think what it also really importantly, it signals that even in liberal democracies, and that's important to say, rights are not guaranteed and that they must always be continually defended.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you very much, Claire, for your insight on this very important topic, and thank you for joining us on this episode of What Matters Today.
Thank you, Dan.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.